Well, it's no secret that I prefer to paint single minis that I find appealing. The giant elephant in the room is that it doesn't always make sense to apply everything you do on a single mini to army painting. While I simply don't have the time to paint an army, I often think of doing one because, well, a coherent and well-painted group of miniatures on the table is an impressive thing to behold. Now, of course, painting minis and how to paint minis always depends on your goal, and of course we want our miniatures to look pretty, but when painting an army, there's always the element of time invested per model. And these two factors, quality and speed, become the parameters that define which techniques or tools we use and the trade-offs we make. Some people don't really care how their armies are painted as long as they're ready to play, and others never finish an army because they just don't want to compromise on quality. I am, and probably you are too, somewhere in the middle. We want decent results, but obviously it should not take until Games Workshop deletes half your miniatures from the range until you're able to play that painted army. So in this video I'll show you my all-time favorite army painting approach, broken down into simple steps, and we will use this Space Wolves box that my local game store Siren Games provided to support the channel. As you might know, I always said if I had to choose an army to paint, it would probably be Necrons, simply because you can create some really awesome effects and make these effects the centerpiece of the army without having to care about a lot of details. Necrons don't need that hair or purity seals or names like Ulfgear, Bearbiter scribbled on in runes. The star of the show here clearly is the OSL, and you can scrape by with dry brushing most of the other details. The other option would be Space Marines, and yeah, I'm just a sucker for these guys like anyone else. There's just something about the shapes of the armor and the archetype that makes them fun to paint. Before we get started, here's a small thing that bothers me with the new box set. I know this has been designed so that new hobbyists have an easier time assembling, but not only are you even more locked into a single pose, like what if I want him to hold the bolt like gangster style like this? You're also stuck with a bunch of bits that have no back of the hand, and at that point they almost become useless for kit bashing. And yeah, you can just sculpt that part if you're somewhat experienced, but it's an extra step that I need to do now. I don't like this development because while you get all these awesome extra bits, you can't properly use them on anything else. But hey, maybe that's just me. Let me know what you think about this development down in the comments. Now, obviously the #1 time saver when army painting is batch painting. So finishing the same step on every mini before moving on to the next, which saves prep time and maximizes actual work time. Another time saver is the airbrush, and I'm gonna die on this hill. If you want to paint an army, not using at least the basic airbrush is masochism. I'm using my budget setup for this, which means my gallery Mobius gun and compressor, which both are linked in the description if you want to pick up a great quality airbrush setup at a reasonable price. I'm spraying a base layer of Army Painter's Deep Grey, which is the perfect color for a couple of Space Wolf schemes, and it also works great as a base for the more bluish scheme that is the current box art, and that I also want to do. And of course, I'm doing that on every mini until all the armor parts are covered in an even layer. Next, I'm building the midtones, and of course, since this is the color that will define the overall look of the minis, and yes, this needs to be the signature bluish gray that screams, yes, I have howled at the moon and eaten raw meat in the snow. Now, of course, you could use Citadel's Rust Grey, Vallejo's Steel Grey, or Army Painter's Wolf Grey, but I personally like AK's Grey Blue the best. If you don't want to think too much about it, I would recommend giving your minis a general coat from above, as that is a light situation that works rather well for most minis and especially for these clean geometric marine shapes. And as you can see on the Wolfguard Battle Leader, sticking to the from above approach works too. But I like taking a little bit more time here and try to define the shapes more individually, simply because it has such a high impact on the finished result. So on the cylinders of the legs, I'm building a vertical reflection, and on the round knees I spray a main highlight from above and a bounce light from below. I'm also carefully building a highlight on the upper area while leaving the lower part darker. I'm creating bigger highlights on flat areas, and on the legs, for example, you can really see how just leaving the edge of the shin guard darker on the outside looks so much more interesting already. In scale modeling, that's called panel modulation, and we're doing something similar here. Next, I'm putting down a layer of paint on all elements that are on or close to the armor, because in the next step, I'm just going to treat most of these parts in an equal manner. That means I'm covering the belt buckle in turquoise and all of the metal parts in silver and gold metallics. One particular element I love about any Space Wolves scheme is the yellow parts. They just work so well as a highlight and stand out so much from the flatter, desaturated main color. Also, yellow weathers up really nicely with orange and brown tones, which is always something I'm looking forward to do. And since I don't have the patience of my Stormcaller meditating under a glacier, I mask and spray the yellow with an airbrush, applying a white base and then Imperial Fist Yellow contrast paint sprayed over it. This combo is so intense it might actually be visible from orbit, perfect for Space Wolves who, let's be honest, aren't exactly known for their subtlety. And I don't think I'll ever paint yellow in another way again. And remember, we are batch painting, so throwing on one layer of whites on all minis and then cleaning the airbrush once quickly to switch and spray one layer of yellow on all the elements of the army I want to paint that way really is no big deal. It's fast, clean, and efficient. Once I have all elements covered in their respective colors, I give all minis a coat of gloss varnish. It's probably more like 2 coats, because you really want these surfaces to be as smooth as a bowling lane. Now I'll show you why here in a second. Look, we all have more miniature kits than we can ever paint. I know you do, because FOMO is a thing and I'm as guilty of it as my next man. But let me show you something cool. Welcome to Miniswap, the first dedicated marketplace for tabletop wargame. It's now easier than ever before to find listings of minis that fit your collection, or to quickly sell minis of your own that you have no use for anymore. Let's say you're a 40k player. You can jump straight to the army you are looking for, or you can search for specific listings in their comprehensive database. Let's say you're looking for old school 28mm metal minis. You can even specify if you want them hand sculpted or not, and you only want single minis packaged in blisters. So in short, you're a true old hammer connoisseur. Just hit search and you can straight away see every product that fits your terms and browse, or jump straight to listings to see what is available right now. Or maybe you are lacking a particular unit in your army's roster and you know exactly what you want. Using Miniswap's autocomplete search allows you to find what you're looking for and see everything that's available. And here's the kicker. You can specify your search even further. Like if you're only looking for assembled minis because you don't have time to build them yourself, and you can even choose pre-painted down to a specific color so they will fit right into your arm. And if there's nothing for sale right now, you can create an alert so you get notified as soon as there is. It only takes seconds to create a listing of your own using their automated data entry process. Get your entire army listed at once with their bulk entry system. You just want to show off your collection. You don't have to list it for sale, but who knows, maybe someone will make you an offer you can't refuse. Miniswap will be live soon. Just head over to Miniswap.gg or use the link in the description to sign up for the waitlist to get notified and receive a special day 1 badge on your profile. If you are running a game store or have lots of minis to sell, Miniswap is offering exclusive promotions and listing support to early sellers. Contact them at onboarding@miniswap.gg to get set up. I'll have more promotions for Miniswap coming soon, and I'll be sharing them here first, so keep an eye on my next videos if you want early access to special offers. The painting approach I want to use for this is relatively old. I remember doing this 20 years ago, and I sure was not the first to use it back then, but it's just really fast and it produces great results. Lots of people use it, but someone who really specializes in it is I1K on Instagram. He really has a knack for how to combine this technique with colors that give ultra crisp results, and I will not do everything exactly the way that he does it, but I'm looking for similar sharp results. Of course, one element of this way to paint is the recess shade, and this can be done with oil washes, but I also want to try enamels because I never really did that, and AK Interactive just came out with these pre-mixed recess washes that I wanted to test. I was instantly drowning the helmet details in this wash, and then I proceeded to let it run into all the recesses of the Mini. And right away things started going off the rails. It was clear that my gloss varnish hadn't done its job. Enamel washes have a low viscosity, and they rely on capillary action to pull them cleanly into the recesses. When the surface is properly smooth, the wash stays where it belongs, in the lines and cracks. But here you can see the wash spreading out in blotches across the flat armor panels, especially on the shoulders and the chest. And that's a clear sign that something went wrong. Likely one of the aerosol layers left behind some microscopic grit, and the Vallejo polyurethane gloss varnish just wasn't able to level it out. Either it didn't smooth over the texture of the layers below, or worse, it created texture of its own. This isn't the first time this happened to me, and frankly, I'm starting to think that Vallejo Gloss might just not be up to the task for this technique. I hadn't bothered testing alternatives until now, but after this session, I ordered a different gloss varnish. And spoiler alert, it worked a lot better, but more on that towards the end of the video. I keep letting the wash flow into all the other recesses too, like the ones separating different sections, and it also helps to define the gold features I painted on the shield, the belt buckle, and the cross on the back. Now all of this looks really messy, not the least due to the flawed surfaces, so the next step is to clean up the mess. Luckily, this is no big deal and easily fixable. Using a small makeup sponge with a little white spirit cleans off the excess enamel wash on the raised areas and leaves the crevices untouched. You just gotta be careful not to press too hard. Use controlled fury and not blind rage. Also, don't drench the makeup sponge in white spirit, otherwise it will wash away the enamel paint too. Of course, all of this can also be done with oil paint that's thinned down with white spirit. Some of my favorite tones are sepia, smoke, starship filth, Payne's gray, and burnt umber. It all depends if you want the wash to be more gray, slightly green, or brown. Here I settled on smoke, which has a bit of both gray and brown, so it would be a good fit for the main color. I thinned it down like usual with white spirit and repeated all the steps I explained before. Generally only add very little white spirit to the wash so it doesn't end up too thin, because you want the wash to cover in one pass. I guess that's one thing the enamels have over the oil wash. You don't need to mix them and can use them right out of the pot. This model cleaned up nicely too with the makeup sponge, but in the more shallow recesses that I also want to define, the sponge would be too crude and would wipe away too much, so I switched to this synthetic brush and dabbed off some of the excess paint. Of course, I'm being a bit of a perfectionist here, and you don't really have to do this if you want to save some time. Once the washes were cured, I gave all the models a layer of matte varnish to seal the progress up until now, and you can already see that this is a great technique to achieve really crisp and sharp results. And moving into the highlights, I want to make it look even sharper. Like I said initially, there is multiple ways to make this work, and all of them have their merits. On very bright colors, you can get away by only doing some dark chipping on the edges to increase definition. Darker models will benefit from some bright edge highlights, but it's all up to you and the result you want. Personally, I like to add some bright edge highlights at this point, and I'm also placing some specular highlights on spherical shapes like the helmet, the knees, and the shoulders. And I'm putting in the highlights with the same color I used for the edge highlights, and then I do a 50-50 mix of this color and the gray-blue to soften the transitions. I'm only picking out very few parts to highlight. This is enough to create an impression of light hitting the features while keeping most of the surfaces smooth and clean. And just like the specular highlights on spherical features, I put a simple and larger highlight on the collar, and then also the top of the chest plate and other apex points. To highlight the bolter, I just picked up a bit of a silver metallic and carefully touched up all the edges. I got rid of most of the paint to make sure it would only slightly rub off as I ran the broadside across the edges, and that leaves a very fine reflective line that still defines all the shapes nicely, because it still is very bright and visible against the rest of the black casing. Now and then I will hit surfaces other than the edges to leave a few chips, lines, and dents for a more credible and used result. And you can probably see that I have some gray on the casing. This is just a bit of overspray from the first layer of gray that I added to the armor with the airbrush, and I think it's a really nice effect, so I didn't cover it in black. It's something different, and I think this fits the Space Wolf scheme. I might be doing that a lot more on bolters, adding subtle gradients that fit my main scheme and then highlighting them uniformly. At this point, I also went in and quickly highlighted the yellow parts, again going for very selective specular highlights. Small dramatic reflections that sell the shape without overcomplicating the surface. I think glints of light catching on edges and surfaces. As for the gray armor plates, additional highlights were kept minimal but intentional. This stage is about enhancing form, not painting rune scrolls on every edge. Then I was adding decals and made sure they were in the right place, softened them out, and added some scratches by scraping over them with a steel needle. Just enough to suggest these markings have seen more than one war zone. At this point I would say this is absolutely playable. We have a midtone, highlights, and shadows. And all of these steps that lead us here are modular. Like All of these steps build on top of the last one, and we are gradually working towards the final result that we want. But for now, you can finish all of these steps and then step away. Play a few games and come back to painting later. No shame in feeling a great company in progress. Add another step to all your minutes this week, the next step a week down the road. To me, it's more important not to rush. If you just slap on a few layers to check the finished box, it's hard to revisit these models later and improve them. But when you build in steps, you can always come back and sharpen things up when you've got the time. So next up, we're going to take these crispy boys and add some weathering and realism. After I painted additional markings on the knees and the chainsword, I added some sponge chipping with white. And I'm doing that because white simply covers better over black. I had to put a bit more white towards the chainsaw part of the sword, simply because the paint would chip a lot more there and I just didn't have that control with the sponge. Also, I could add an extra line here and there, which is better to do with the brush. Then I simply added one layer of Imperial Fists contrast paint over the white, and it was done and looked coherent. Then it was time to work on the dark chipping, and with chipping you can just slap a bit of dark paint on with a sponge if you want to be super fast, but I want to do it with a brush, just because I want more agency over where the chipping happens. Sponge chipping is fun, but it can feel like giving a Fenrisian toddler a plasma gun. Chaotic and unpredictable. On screen you can see how I mix my chipping color, and there's a few ideas packaged into this mixing process. So let me explain. First, I'm deciding what I want the color to be. So I'm using a dark gray and I mix that with burnt umber ink, and I add a bit of black here and there. And not only does the ink add a rich brown tone to my chipping color, you can also see that the surface tension increases massively. That matters even for sponge chipping because it gives you jagged, irregular shapes instead of big round blobs. You get finer and sharper marks that read better at scale, and more like battle damage and less like ketchup splatter. Last but not least, I'm adding a bit of drying retarder, and I love the one by Army Painter because most other retarders are gel-like, and this one isn't, so it mixes in a lot better. And let me say it again, you could just grab a sponge at this point and dab on the chipping with it, but I just want to place the weathering in a more controlled way. So I'm grabbing a brush with a really fine tip because that allows a maximum of control over what shape your chips will have. You see edges are no problem. I just use the broad side of the tip and drag it or dab it along. Then I make some of these initial patches wider as I see fit, and I'll throw in dots of various sizes here and there. I focus a lot on edges during this step, not only because they receive a lot more wear, but also because on the bright main color this creates readability, which means the dark edges frame the light elements and guide your eye a bit more as it explores all the shapes, and if our brain understands what's going on, then it's pleased and thinks this is a good mini. So I will say I'm a bit of a chipping nut. Not only do I find this stuff relaxing, I also have a very particular idea about how this chip should look. So I'm doing all my chipping by brush. Don't look at me like that. Some people meditate. I wear the little plastic warriors one chip at a time. Yeah, so again, I usually start by hitting the edges of a shape, thinking where it would get damaged more, obviously on the feet, and an area that is closer to the ground, and then I move on to making these dents wider in some places and adding lines and different sizes of chips to the surface of the shape. For all these small lines and dots, proper brush with a reliable tip is key here. And you can find a link in the description to the brushes I use if you want to pick some proper ones up. You will also notice how I don't have to pick up any paint during this process, and that's mainly due to a proper belly on the brush that holds a lot of paint, but also because I painstakingly prepared the mix I used for the chipping the way I showed earlier. It's so annoying when you constantly have to pick up paint. I just hate that. You're just getting into the zone and then dry tip. No paint, no joy. But here I can literally chip a whole leg before I need to pick up paint again. And that's another reason why this doesn't really take as long as you might expect. So I add chips to all exposed areas, like down on the feet and the top of the helmet, and then add it to all of these areas that are a little flat right now. I like how it just instantly adds depth to the shapes and makes it look real and less like a plastic mini, but a warrior that has been through something. For the longest time I wasn't quite sure how to paint Games Workshop's fur. But this approach I kind of like, maybe because it looks a little bit more realistic. So first I put down a light beige and then gradually add more darker brown tones towards the middle. Eventually I'm hitting these parts with some pure burnt umber ink to add some richness to the browns, and then I also add a little bit of black on top. Once these general gradients are established, I'm using a middle brown tone and I push the paint into recesses exactly where the gradient changes from very dark to bright. And what this does is it looks like there's brighter hair below the dark parts, and that's exactly what happens with real fur sometimes, which makes this look even more believable. At this point I'm also adding some gray to the almost black parts for additional variety and some highlights, and then I also put a very bright beige into the recesses towards the outside of the fur parts. I think this way of focusing more on the big picture of the fur, so the overall look, and less on the individual strains, is a really good trade-off between time investment and result. I finish out some details like the skull on the shield, which I covered in a greenish brown and then gradually added more beige, and then also touched up small details like fangs and straps. And finally, I also painted all the gems. And these are really fun to do, and of course you could paint them traditionally, but I like tinting everything with contrast paints and speed paints lately. So I built the reflection pattern with white first, having the biggest reflection in the top right corner, because that's where I assumed the light source to be if you check the other reflections on the armor, and then covered that in plasmatic bold by Army Painter. A quick little dab with white in the end brings back the brightness, and we are ready to finish the metallics. So I'm grabbing Caribbean Ocean and I'm glazing it over the lower parts of the metallics. I do that because I want the chill from the frozen world below to subtly reflect on the mini. And it makes sense to do that in the reflective parts. And don't forget, we are totally in optional territory here now. So if I had everything else finished on these minis, this would be one step after I probably played a few games already and I grew very fond of them. And now I really want to make them unique and my own army, and I'm invested to really make these shine and make them unique and special. Using tainted gold, I'm polishing the gold metallics a bit, getting rid of most of the paint on the brush, and you can see that by looking at how little my brush is glittering. There's just the tiniest amount of paint, and I'm just dragging it slightly over all surfaces I want brighter and reflective. And that also means the edges on the shield, of course. I decided to keep the sword simple, so I mainly covered the metallics in Caribbean Ocean, creating gradients on both edges and then bringing back some shine in specific areas. I treated the islands as very similar to the gems. First, I put down a little red directly over black, and then I covered less space with white. Then I took red fluor paint and covered everything with a couple of layers. I'm making sure all the white is stained equally, and I also let it collect in the black recesses, which adds a bit of a glow effect. And then finally, I bring back the white reflections. I thought about doing some freehands on the inside of the cape, just because it's a really large surface to remain empty, but then instantly opted for repurposing some of the rune decals that came in the box, basically just lining the lower seam of the cape with them. And of course that's a lot faster than the freehand approach. One consideration I always have when thinking about armies is that helmets are a lot easier to paint quickly than faces. And I guess if this wasn't Space Wolves, where the Viking adjacent long hair and beards is part of the aesthetic, I would most likely just do helmets. To speed things up a little, I do next to no blending on this, mainly adding layers of consecutively brighter colors in the usual places: cheekbones, back of the nose, and forehead. And I also gave the hair a brown color with sharp highlights. Once all the last details, like hitting all the rivets with a bright silver metallics, was done, I was ready to do the last step. You could argue that this step should have been done before the detail work, but I really want to dump a lot of gloss varnish on the models this time, just to make sure I have absolutely smooth surfaces for the next step, and that could potentially gunk up some of the smaller detail. I did grab this acrylic gloss varnish. This is part of the new paint range by Gallery, and I'm really glad I finally tried another gloss varnish, since this one not only gives a so much smoother result, I can blast it on without much regard for anything because it was designed to be used that way. Just look at all these words on the back. Wow. I decided on a limited number of oil washes, and I mainly used the reddish burnt sienna and the brown wash and applied some dots to the surfaces. I tried to put them directly on chips because surface imperfections is usually where streaking starts. And then using some pure white spirit, I used a brush to drag the oil paint downwards with periodic movements of the brush. Again, don't use too much of the solvent or you will wash all of the oil paint away. And also I found that you have to experiment a little with the brushes you use. This is a technique that comes from scale modeling, and usually you do this on large surfaces, tanks for example, and you use a bigger brush to create multiple streaks at once. Here I'm basically trying to create one streak at a time, and smaller synthetic brushes with stiffer bristles have been my go-to. Again, this step is optional, but not only do I love how this draws everything together, there's so much going on the armor. The bright highlights, the details like the chips and the streaks, making the armor look even more real. Sometimes the oil paint will spread a little over the surface, and I like how it becomes more of a filter at that point, adding additional variety to the different panels. You can also dab some oil paint into recesses and then use some white spirit to feather out the transition, like I did for some additional weathering on the chainsaw. It's that orange that works so well on yellow bases that I mentioned before. And speaking about bases, after I blasted everything again in matte varnish to seal the work, I dumped some Green Stuff World liquid pigment directly over the still mostly black ground texture to set up the snow base. This took about 2 layers until I was happy. And then I followed this up by some white liquid pigment. And I only used 1 layer this time to make sure it runs into recesses and doesn't cover too much of the blue. Note how I also let some of the white run into the recesses of the feet. This ties the mini together with the setting we are creating around it. It's a minor detail at first sight, but has a giant impact. And finally, I'm dabbing on Green Stuff World snow texture in areas where snow would collect. And I make sure to also cover parts of the feet, seam of the cloak, as it might get dragged through the snow here and there, and also the fur. And here's the result. Went from quick and efficient base techniques all the way through to detailed weathering, adding those battle-worn touches that really bring these guys to life, like they're just in the middle of a brutal Fenrisian hunt. I love how the modular approach lets you build your army step by step, whether you're rushing to the table or taking your time to make each model truly unique. It's flexible, it's rewarding, and best of all, it means you can grow your pack at your own pace without sacrificing quality. Honestly, I'm really happy with how these turned out. They've got that perfect mix of rugged, icy grit and sharp detail that fits the Viking adjacent Space Wolves vibe perfectly. And if you're looking to paint your own pack, hopefully this video gave you some solid ideas and techniques to make it easier and more fun. Thanks for watching. Subscribe if you haven't, please. It helps the channel a lot. And keep pushing that pigment, and see you in the next one.